Welcome to Vendetta Sports Media. My name is James Herrick, and today I am here to do a film study on UFC welterweight Gilbert Burns in anticipation of his fight with Jorge Masvidal at UFC 287. Now, you may be curious as to why we're doing Gilbert Burns when the main event is between Israel Adesanya and Alex Pereira. Well, simple enough. We have already done film studies on Israel Adesanya and Alex Pereira, so make sure you go and check those out. And if you haven't seen one of these film studies before, the structure is pretty simple. What I do is I watch some film, and then I bring two strengths and two weaknesses of a fighter's game to you and show you some clips to kind of show what I'm talking about. And when I'm done with the clips and the strengths and the weaknesses, I then craft game plans as to how that fighter can win a fight and what an opponent can do to beat that fighter. So that is what we are doing today for Gilbert Burns. The first strength in Gilbert Burns' game that I really like is his ability to counter-strike. A lot of the times when Gilbert Burns is able to land a big shot or a fight-changing shot is because he landed a strong counter-strike. And one of the reasons he's such a good counter-striker is because he has really good timing. He's able to time his opponents very well and anticipate the strikes that they're throwing. That allows him to set up a counter, and he's quick as well, so he can then land that counter. And the power is what really makes that a fight-changing shot, because he can land and land hard. Now, the other thing that really makes him a successful counter-striker is that he has a lot of different counter-strikes that he's comfortable with and good at. So, a lot of guys can counter-strike a jab. They can slip a jab and throw a hook, or they can slip a jab and come to an uppercut. And that's something that Gilbert Burns is very, very good at. But he can also step into a leg kick and land a counter straight or a counter hook off a leg kick. We have an example in here where he landed a counter knee as Usman level changes. So Gilbert Burns has a ton of different counter strikes that he can land, and we're not going to look at every single example of every single time he lands a counter strike or every single counter strike he has in his arsenal, because we'd be here all day. So instead, with these clips, we're going to look at some of the more successful times that he's landed a counter strike, or some of the more impactful times. The first thing to notice with this counter is Burns' timing. Burns does a really good job of timing Usman's jab and unleashing his counter right hand the second that Usman throws that jab. He also throws from a very good angle where he makes sure to get over top of that jab, but he's also coming from the outside, which kind of plays into the direction that Usman is circling into. So in this clip, Burns gets hit with a really solid uppercut. When that happens, Chimaev starts to hunt a finish, and he throws some defensive fundamentals out the window. One of the ways this happens is that Chimaev leaves his jab hand out for too long, which you can see here. Burns takes advantage of that by once again throwing that big right hand over top of the jab and connecting with a massive shot. I really like this clip here because this is a very effective counter to someone looking to enter the clinch. So we can see Usman attempt a level change and try to attack those hips. As he does that, Gilbert perfectly throws this knee up the middle. It lands square and hurts Usman. And then in this last one, Gilbert times the step-in hook very well so that he steps in while Usman is kicking. This makes the hook easier to land because you can't really move your head as you kick. The second strength in Gilbert Burns' game that I really liked was his ability to apply pressure from the top. And a lot of people know that Gilbert Burns is a very good BJJ practitioner, and one of the ways we see that in action is how he applies the pressure once he gets someone down. And this is very, very useful in MMA because, one, it makes it a lot harder for guys to stand up. If you're able to apply a lot of pressure and pressure in several different areas, it makes it hard for a guy to get back to his feet. That is especially useful if you're fighting a dynamic striker or someone that you don't want to strike with. It makes it easier to hold them down if you know how to apply a lot of pressure from top. But if you're fighting someone with really good submissions off the bottom, it also helps you prevent their ability to set up offensive submissions from the bottom. So you're keeping guys on the ground and you're preventing them from attacking you from bottom. So this is a very good skill to have, and it is something that Gilbert Burns excels at. One thing Gilbert is really good at is applying pressure as soon as he gets a takedown. So the second that he lands this takedown, he immediately scoops the head of Thompson, which allows him to apply shoulder pressure on Thompson's head. And then he's able to scoop that leg, which then allows him to pressure with his hips onto Wonderboy's legs, which kind of keeps him on his side, which is not a very advantageous position if you're looking to escape. I really want to highlight Burns' ability to apply shoulder pressure, and in this clip we can see him do a really good job of getting control of Magny and scooping that head. And what I really like about this is he can, one, apply a lot of pressure with his shoulder, and two, he can also transition to applying pressure with his forehead at any given time. And then with this freeze frame, I want to highlight some specific points of pressure. Let's start with the head of Gilbert Burns. You can see him just burying the top of his head into Wonderboy's chin to pin him right up against the cage. And then his chest, you can see him chest to chest, and he's got the tight waist underneath to make that even tighter. He's also got wrist control, and he's also using his hips and really controlling the lower body of Thompson as well. So you can just really see here with this freeze frame all the different points of pressure that Burns can apply from the top position. The first weakness in Gilbert Burns' game that I don't like is that he can sometimes really struggle to land shots from range and struggle while he's moving forward to land shots. And this doesn't make him a bad striker, right? He's still a good striker. He, as I mentioned earlier, he's a really good counter striker. He does a lot better when he's pressuring guys and has them backed up against a fence. Before that, when he's out in the open, he struggles to land shots. And this is for a couple reasons. I think the first is because he's not elite at setting up these strikes. That's what happens when you're a BJJ practitioner, moves over to MMA. You're not going to be as elite at setting up strikes from a distance. But he's also shorter than a lot of guys at welterweight. Shorter than Wonderboy Thompson, shorter than Neil Magny, shorter than Khamzat Chimaev. He was even shorter than Usman, who isn't really a big, tall welterweight. And this issue is a little bit worse against some of these really tall strikers, where it makes it hard to close the distance and land these shots. So he's often swinging at air from the outside. I also do want to add, this is a little bit more of a problem when it comes to landing punches. He's a little bit better with the kicks, and that's because the kicks often go to the body or to the legs. But when he does mix in some head kicks, those can often get blocked. Sometimes they don't land. But overall, I think the punches are the biggest issue at play here. And I don't have a ton of clips for you because I don't really think it's, super noteworthy to look at a bunch of clips of him just swinging at air. So we're just going to show a couple of examples that kind of illustrate the problem that I'm talking about. Like I said, this is pretty simple, but we can just see Gilbert Burns not really do much to set up this hook. He jumps in with a lead hook, and Usman's just easily able to duck underneath it. And then here we see Usman kind of start to walk Burns down a little, but Burns, he throws this head kick out there that really just hits the shoulder, and the hook behind it doesn't really have much of a chance of landing. In this one, Wonderboy and Burns are in opposite stances, and Burns tries to get to the outside so he can land this power hook, but Wonderboy sees it coming. All he has to do is slide back and avoid it. Now, the second weakness in Gilbert Burns' game that I don't like is that he often lets his lead hand drop down to his hip after he throws. So what this will look like is he'll throw a lead hook or he'll throw a lead jab, and that hand that he throws with will kind of just drift down to his hip afterwards. And this really leaves him vulnerable to counter strikes and guys looking to return once he lands an offensive shot. And, I would like to add a caveat to this where sometimes, right, the hand's down by the side, but he does a really good job of pulling back and avoiding those shots, right? So he doesn't get hit every time he makes this mistake, but there are a lot of examples where he leaves that hand down, he lets that hand drift down to his hip, and he's hit with a big counter strike. So even if this doesn't come back to haunt him every single time he makes that mistake, he makes a mistake too often, and he does it enough to where he gets punished for it, right? So we're going to look at the specific examples of him getting punished for kind of dropping that lead hand and leaving his opponent's opportunities to hit him. Nothing crazy happens here, but we're just using this as an example of the problem. I want you to watch the left hand of Gilbert Burns. He throws that left hand out and just kind of drops it down to his hip. And then here it is again one more time. This becomes a pretty big problem against Usman, and we can see him throw out that jab. That hand then goes to the hip, which allows Usman to counter with a big straight. And then here you can really see that lead hand that should be up towards the chin. You can see it down by the hip, which creates that opening that Usman lands on. And then here against Wonderboy, we just have a more chaotic version of the same issue where he's pressuring forward very hard, throws the left hand drops. Wonderboy counters with a straight. And then once again, the freeze frame can really show you where that hand is, and you can kind of see how the lead hand is out of position. And there's several things he could have done to fix this. He could have brought the hand to the chin. He could have fixed some shoulder position. There's things he could have done, but still, he's out of position for when this shot comes. Now we're going to start crafting some game plans, and we're going to start with a game plan that Gilbert Burns can use to win fights. And one of the nice things about Gilbert Burns is that since he's such a good grappler, he can go out there and out-grapple strikers. And since he's such a good striker, he can go out there and out-strike a lot of grapplers. Obviously, he's lost a couple fights in the stand-up, but that was against really good guys like Usman and Chimaev. And in both those fights, he almost won, right? Almost finished both guys. Almost got the decision win against Chimaev. So a couple of really close fights that just, a couple things could have went differently, and he could have won those fights. So I don't think those fights are an indictment in his striking, but rather show how he can go out there and really strike with some elite fighters. So if we're looking to craft a game plan that is not opponent-specific, the first thing that I would really think Gilbert Burns should do is grapple early. And I say that because if you're able to land the takedown and you're able to find success on the ground, that is an obvious avenue for him to find a finish. With the submissions, it's an obvious avenue for him to control the fight on the ground, right? It's very beneficial for him to do. But the reason that I really think it's beneficial is because on the feet, if he's able to get the grappling going, he can then use the threat of the grappling to set up his offensive skills. He can start feigning takedowns and landing some hooks, right? He can do those things that he probably wouldn't be able to do if it weren't for the grappling that he has in his back pocket. And I think this can really help solve that issue of setting up strikes from the outside. If you're able to get the grappling going and use that grappling to set up shots, that's something that is a little bit more unique to grapplers and something that I think can ease that first issue that we saw in his game. From there, a couple other things that I'd like to see in the striking is that I'd like to see him throw more kicks, right? I think Gilbert Burns has a very good body kick and some strong leg kicks. I'd like to see him use those weapons more. The body kick, I think, is really, really underrated, probably his most underrated tool in his game. So I'd like to see him use those more often. The head kick, he's got a good head kick, but he's a little bit short to throw it consistently. So probably just stick to the body kick and the leg kick. But those are tools that I think are good that he should use more often. And then more of a movement thing or more of a cage control thing, I really want to see him work to back guys up against the fence, right? This is because he's a much more effective striker when he's got guys backed up. So some ways that I think Gilbert can be successful at this is if he throws those kicks more and gets guys to back out of range of the kicks. But I also think he can feint some of his big power hooks, some of his big power overhands, and get guys to move backwards to kind of avoid those shots. If you can do that enough, you can get a guy really backed up against the fence. Once he gets someone backed up, that's when he can really be successful because guys are going to start to look to circle off the fence. And when guys are circling off the fence, that then presents the opportunity to get a guy moving into a hook or moving into an overhand. So I think that is probably the best kind of route for Gilbert is to get guys backed up, and then that can really help him land a lot of these big power shots. With that being said, I don't think he should move away from the counter-striking. The counter-striking is elite, so I do still think that should be a focal point in his game plan, but I do think these other things can help kind of add another layer on top of his already elite counter-striking. Now, to craft a game plan against Gilbert Burns, I think it's kind of hard because Gilbert Burns doesn't have any glaring weaknesses, but I think there are some things that you can do to really attack Gilbert that I think you can find success in. And the first thing is the jab, right? This section should be focused around the jab, I think, at least when it comes to striking. Should be focused around the jab, both offensively and defensively. So, offensively, I think you should throw a lot of jabs. And that may sound strange because he is such a good counter-striker. So why would you throw a lot of jabs? Why would you give him a lot of opportunities to counter-strike? Well, this was something that Kamaru Usman did really, really well, was he threw so many jabs that Burns couldn't counter every single jab he threw. Burns had success countering the jab, right? But Usman ended up throwing so many jabs that they started landing, and they started landing hard. And he was throwing so many that Burns just simply couldn't counter every single jab that Usman was throwing his way. So I think that really picking up the pace with the jab, throwing a lot of jabs, is a good first step. So I think that is the first thing you should do. But also, if Gilbert starts pumping that jab out there, starts throwing that lead hand, right? Is he slipping it down to the hip? Is it going down to the hip? If it is, you start throwing straights back his way. And if, there's a good chance he starts to slip some of those. If he's able to kind of move out of the way of those straights, then you go something with a little bit of a wider angle, something, maybe lean into it a little bit more, maybe start throwing some hooks at the end of it, start throwing some overhands, because his pattern of movement is like out and back if he is sliding out of the way of those shots. So that's when you can go to like an overhand or a hook to try and catch him if these straights aren't landing. So counter his jab or return after he lands a jab. So that's kind of what I mean by focusing around the jab, both offensively and defensively. And then I also want to see fighters back Gilbert up, right? This is pretty much just the inverse of the thing that I said Gilbert needed to do, right? I said Gilbert needed to back guys up. So if you're fighting Gilbert, don't get backed up and instead back him up. And this is more for defensive purposes really than offensive purposes. A lot of guys, the game plan is to get them backed up against the fence so they can land a lot of good offensive strikes. I think a good example of this is how Alex Pereira beat Israel Adesanya in their last fight. He did a really good job of backing him up on the fence and landing big power shots. Now, when you're fighting Burns, I think it's more beneficial defensively because you can back him up. Get him up against the fence. And since he's not, an elite striker at setting up shots, you then can easily move back and out of the way and left and right of his shots. So it helps you defensively to have that room at your back to avoid those shots. You still have to avoid the counter strikes. You can't get wild. You got to be really fundamental. You got to make sure you're keeping your hands up. You're watching out for those return shots. But backing him up is a really good first step in making sure you're staying safe defensively because you're leaving yourself more opportunities to avoid those shots. And then when it comes to the grappling, if you had to poke a hole in Gilbert Burns' grappling, it'd be the takedown offense. I do think Gilbert Burns has good takedowns, right? I've seen some really strong takedowns, some takedowns I was really impressed with on film. But overall, he doesn't attempt a ton of takedowns, and he isn't perfect, right? He isn't as good at going out there and landing a takedown as someone like Usman or as someone like Colby Covington, who are both in that same division. I think once Gilbert gets it on the ground, he's probably a little bit better at controlling that position, right? Landing submissions. And probably maybe not as good at the ground and pound as someone like Usman. But when it comes to going out there and getting the takedown, not as strong. But submissions much stronger. All right. A little bit off track there. But getting back on track. Defending the takedown is obviously the first step, right? But it's also your best chance, right? So I would say devote a lot of effort to defending that takedown, right? Whatever you do to not get taken down is beneficial. Gilbert Burns will often start with single legs, and then he'll either move to a double or get you backed up against the fence. So start it with the single leg defense, pressure on the head. I wouldn't necessarily say to attack submissions. It's just really not worth it. You're probably not going to submit Gilbert Burns. I don't think that's a strong idea. But really, start to attack, with head pressure and with fishing for some underhooks and some wizards. I think those are some really good steps to defending the takedown. And then if you get to the clinch, I think that is a good opportunity to strike. I think if you can look to land maybe a knee or some big elbows from the clinch, I think those are beneficial steps. But once again, he's going to be trying to take you down. So you have to find that balance of, all right, I'm going to be offensive. But at the same time, you really have to be mindful of, all right, here's a good time for me to dig for an underhook. Here's a good time for me to lash on to a wizard. There's a lot of things that you can do in that position, but you really just have to find the balance of when am I going to clinch strike? When am I going to really look to defend these takedowns? You have to find that balance and really be opportunistic and look to defend those takedowns because once he gets you to the ground, he is much, much harder to counter grapple against. Thank you for watching this film study on Gilbert Burns. I hope you learned at least something about Gilbert Burns or something about fighting in general. I hope this was beneficial to you. If it was, make sure you subscribe. Make sure you like the video. Do all that jazz. But also make sure you go and check out vendettasportsmedia.com. Lots of content on there, not just UFC stuff. NFL draft stuff is at a peak right now, so make sure to go check out some of that stuff as well. Just about any sport you can think of, we've got over at vendettasportsmedia.com, so make sure you go and check out the website as well. But most importantly, thank you for tuning in to this video, and we'll see you next time.